Hey, good morning, everyone, in U.S. History 2. I am going to do a brief summary of what I think are the high points or the important points of Chapter 28. And I do like the title, although it's disturbing, it's The Unraveling. And it's that period in American history, although it overlaps somewhat with the earlier Chapter 27, um, dealing with the Civil Rights Movement and other phenomenon that was occurring in the annals of American history. But Chapter 28 is focusing on the latter part of the 1960s and really into the 1970s, right up to Jimmy Carter's election, really tailing off really to his defeat, showing the underlying weaknesses of his potential to be reelected. And the title of the chapter and the segue it begins with is a little bit, well, it's a little bit depressing because the optimism of the progressive era of peace, love, and harmony, and all those things that sometimes the 60s gets remembered for, and the advances of the Civil Rights Union get lost in a bit of a disillusionment. And a major part of it's because of the Vietnam War. We had been involved in quite some time in Vietnam, supporting the French before they ultimately get capitulated by the Viet Cong. We get involved significantly initially with advisors, but then later, after the Johnson administration becomes engaged full time, we start losing significant amount of treasure financially, as well as American troops start dying in that conflict. Although it was never a declaration of war, the Congress, because of um, the resolution passed by Congress, was given the authority to enter troops into that war. But over this period of time, especially in the late 1960s, there was constant news briefings telling the American people the war was being won, and it was based largely on statistical bits of evidence that was constantly being promoted by not only the Johnson administration, but after the Johnson administration, be the Nixon administration, showing the huge disparity in troop losses between the Viet Cong and the United States military was so unbalanced that we're clearly winning the war. And it would show different areas that were now under U.S. control and all these successes. But yet there was a reality that even the news media started getting a sense that this was largely twisted truth. And it gave the American people, in the end, a great deal of distrust in their government, basically lying to them about what was going on in Vietnam. Part of it came out in 1973 in a newspaper. I believe it was either the Washington Post or the New York Times. I can probably jump to it real quick, and it was called the Pentagon Papers. In fact, one of the person that released them is speaking in the area as we speak. I'm not going to give the date of this video because I might use it again for next semester, but he's speaking about his fear of going to jail as a result of doing it. It's the New York Times and the Washington Post. Both of them actually produced it. And it was 1971. I apologize. I said 1973. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg basically got these reports from the Pentagon, thus the Pentagon Papers, and put them out in the press, showing that the war was actually going quite poorly, and it was not succeeding at all. And basically, the American people were lied to. When those things came out in the prints, and the media itself started calling the news press conferences by the military brass, if you will, and the State Department, they called them the 5 o'clock follies because they were purely based upon fiction and truth bending. And the American people started getting very disillusioned in not only the Vietnam War, but got disillusioned in their faith in government because their government was misleading them about the success of the war. Finally, because of the release of the Pentagon Papers and the lack of progress and the loss of American lives and money in the adventures in Vietnam, for lack of a better way of saying it, made the American people turn on the involvement in Vietnam. And eventually they passed the Wars Power Act in 1973, which limited the president's ability to engage in military incursion into foreign countries without the consent of Congress. And Congress ultimately ends, if you will, or brings much more pressure to end the Vietnam conflict by basically withholding funding to the Vietnam War. And so in the 1960s, we know we have Lyndon Johnson decides, because the Vietnam War is going so poorly and some of his economic policies are costing the country a great deal of money, so we're spending time and treasure not only in the Great Society here in the United States, spending money on social programs and trying to advance and ending poverty. The war on poverty was hugely costly to the American budget. Inflation starts to grow, and now the Vietnam War is taking a lot of lives. There's a lot of heartache in terms of actual loved ones being lost, but also the financial repercussions of the Vietnam War were bringing the Lyndon Johnson's popularity down to, well, very poor numbers. And as 1968 approached, he could run for re-election. He only served 1 year of the remaining term of John F. Kennedy after his assassination. He got elected pretty much in a landslide, beating Barry Goldwater in 64. But as 68 was approaching, well, a lot of people don't know this, but Lyndon Johnson had a very difficult heart condition. He was not doing very well physically. He decided not to run because a guy by the name of Eugene McCarthy from the upper Midwest decided to run in his own party. It's kind of unheard of. If you're a Democratic president, occasionally you'll have an opponent from within the party to run, but for the most part, you rally around the incumbent if you're from that party. First, it was Eugene McCarthy came out, and once Eugene McCarthy did not beat Lyndon Johnson in the primary in New Hampshire, but came very close, which sort of stunned the political world, and they knew that Lyndon Johnson was in trouble, and Robert F. Kennedy shortly thereafter entered the race as well. And so in a shocking news media event, because Lyndon Johnson was going on and doing press conferences quite a bit, mostly about the success in Vietnam, which was obviously an illusion, he announced he would not seek nor would he accept the nomination of his party for re-election in 1968. It kind of shocked the American people. This is before my time. I was alive, I was a little kid, and I have no recollection of it whatsoever, that part of it. And ultimately, Hubert Humphrey, the vice presidential candidate was the vice president during Lyndon Johnson's administration, a very progressive political leader, very popular with unions, but he couldn't shake the identity of LBJ, who became so unpopular, mostly over the Vietnam War, that it ushered in a new, more moderate but yet conservative candidacy, because people saw the unraveling. That's what the title of the chapter was. The American society was very, very splintered politically, socially, economically, and there's a sense that America sort of lost its way. We didn't trust our government anymore. We weren't unified in our approaches to foreign affairs, and Nixon came in with a concept of a tough law and order. Crime was very high at this time, and a promise to get us out with Vietnam with, as he said, with honor. What that exactly meant, we didn't know. And unfortunately, Nixon did not get us out of Vietnam after getting elected. He actually escalated it for a period of time, did massive, massive bombing in Cambodia and Laos, trying to cut off the supply lines for the northern Vietnamese Viet Cong. And it was totally unsuccessful. But for a period of time, the war got significantly escalated under Nixon. So these strains of Vietnam are a big undercurrent for this chapter. There's no question about it. As a result of these strains, the Vietnam War was questioned in terms of why are we even there? And there were some stories, one by Seymour Hersh, who I believe is still alive, published it's a bit of a scandalous reporter, but one thing he published that was true was about American troops massacring and maybe doing some other very terrible things to a Vietnamese community that might have been aiding the Viet Cong, and that was the massacre of hundreds of civilians in the village of My Lai. And that was a huge sensation in the news media, and people are saying, why are American soldiers doing that? And it became total disillusionment for the morality of the entire endeavor to basically stem the expansion of communism. Didn't seem so clear to the American people anymore. And then, of course, the big one, the Tet Offensive of 1968. The Tet Offensive was not successful in terms of a military campaign, but literally hundreds of military posts and government offices throughout South Vietnam, which is supposedly, fighting North Vietnam at the time, were attacked by the Viet Cong. And it showed that the war was not going well. It showed that they basically could attack anywhere in the nation. And although they were repelled and suffered much more losses than the Americans or the Southern Vietnam military sustained during the time, it showed basically what? The North Vietnam were determined, and they were very, very healthy in terms of a political and military movement. And that certainly disenfranchised our view of government, and also Lyndon Johnson's likelihood of re-election. And so Nixon runs on this law and order because there was a lot of riots going on, there was a lot of lawlessness and looting in the period of time, and a lot of people felt that the American society was becoming unraveled. So he runs on a conservative platform of law and order, but also we're going to get out of Vietnam with peace and honor, and that didn't really happen as a result of that. And we know that students were killed at both the University of Mississippi and the more famous story of, Kent State University in Ohio, where basically during protests, the National Guard was called out and shots were fired, and students, peaceful demonstrating students, died. And that was stunning to the nation, if not the world. And that created more disillusionment with this sort of society is fractured and it's going to fall apart. And as a result of that, a lot of people, especially those active in voting and participating, sort of started trending towards conservatism. We want a more stable government, a more stable society. And when you watch the convention of 1968, which I've watched a lot of film footage of it because I find it very intriguing, the Democratic Party's convention was just a huge riot outside. Student protesters, they were getting beaten to crap by Mayor Daley's law and order, National Guard, and police. They were being arrested while peacefully demonstrating, but then the students just escalated themselves once that started beginning, and it created a horror show right on the evening news of watching the Democratic National Convention, and that scared people. And so Richard Nixon, although scary in his own way, at least at the time of 1968, represented a more conservative model of government, and most people were very thirsty about ending the Vietnam conflict. And here's the thing I think that really sums up this chapter in terms of the cultural shifting that was going on. It says, the monolith of popular American culture, pillared in the 50s and 60s as exclusively white, male-dominated, conservative, and stifling, finally shattered, and Americans retreated into even smaller segmented subcultures. We became fractured, and there's some truth to that. I was just thinking, one of my good friends, I wish he was here so I could say he's much older than me, but he is much older than me. He actually campaigned for Eugene McCarthy, and back then a lot of the people that wanted Eugene McCarthy were kind of, I don't want to say hippies, but they were long-haired college students, significant number of them, and part of their campaign when they go to different colleges to get students to rally around them was, before you go door to door and hand out literature and campaign for Eugene, you have to get clean. And so they would have buttons they would wear to this different students. It was called Get Clean for Gene. And I collect political buttons. I don't know if I have a Get Clean for Gene button up there, but I do have some in my collection somewhere. And Eugene McCarthy nearly pulled off the freaking thing as a very liberal, but he didn't have the personality of like a Bobby Kennedy, and he didn't have the national presence of a Hubert Humphrey. But I just find that period of time very fascinating. Well, I was alive, but I had no knowledge of it. I was 4 or 5 years old. And they show the violence that was going on in the African American communities. And one of the things that was really interesting was there was a study done. President Johnson wanted to know what the heck was going on, so he studied a commission. It was called the Kerner Commission, and the commission cited Black frustration with the hopelessness of poverty as the underlying cause of urban unrest. And it took rocket science to figure that one out. But this urban unrest was really genuine during the late 1960s. The Watts riots, New York riots, Detroit riots, New Jersey, they were all over the place. And of course, the interesting thing that happens during this period of time in April 1968, we know Martin Luther King Jr., the advocate of peaceful protest, gets assassinated. And you could see why people might get disillusioned with taking a peaceful approach to finding equity and equality in society. And some people thought that was part of the underlying disillusionment with doing things peacefully. And we know in not too long that night, as a matter of fact, after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, there were riots throughout the country in most major cities, except for one, Indianapolis, Indiana. And some people think the reason why there wasn't one was Bobby Kennedy was going to give a campaign speech, and he just got news that Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. And I urge you to Google it and watch it if you want. It's a pretty short speech, but it isn't always just the words he stated. it was the vulnerability in his voice and the genuineness of it, I think, that sold a lot of people. And many of the people that were supporting Bobby Kennedy's candidacy, he had changed quite a bit ever since his brother John F. Kennedy's assassination, became a very progressive leader for equity and justice and fairness for especially minority groups. He gave a speech and he tried to tell people not to deal with it with violence and not to hate everybody in that moment. And some people suggest that with the speech he gave in Indianapolis curtailed violence there because it was one of the few major cities that didn't have racial unrest that evening. I don't know if it's true, but it's nice to think it is. That sometimes words can overcome great disillusionment. But explosive violence really started to take over the inner cities in the late 1960s, and that led to more conservatism politically because people don't like to see that. And I like this quote here. It said, after the Watts riots, Bernard Rustin had a great quote. He says, as they toured the devastation in Watts some years earlier, and now I've got to do something to help them get money to buy it, was Martin Luther King supposedly reporting that to Bernard Rustin before he had died. He says, what good is the right to enter the store that we fought so hard for if you don't have the money to buy anything? And Martin Luther King Jr.'s shift just before his death, actually he was in the area where he was assassinated, was actually campaigning for better wages for sanitation workers because he started recognizing that equity in terms of the way society works has to sometimes boil down to economics. So the crisis of 68, the Vietnam War, and then we know in June of 68, Bobby Kennedy, that's probably my favorite candidate to collect campaign memorabilia from. Was also assassinated. This whole disillusionment with society is like really falling apart, and it was a real view. And so Richard Nixon, although I don't really like Richard Nixon, I don't think I have a ton of Richard Nixon stuff too. He was a very smart guy. There's no question about it. He graduated the first or second in law school. He was the vice president for 2 administrations under Ike Eisenhower. He's no dummy. And he wasn't, a lot of people think he was very, very conservative. He wasn't conservative. He was actually quite a moderate leader, but he tapped into the mindset of the American people. And he called it the silent majority. And we've often heard that term in political, those who take political science class, and you'll hear that sometimes there's sort of a unspoken mass of consensus of where the country needs to go, but they're not outspoken. They're not out in the fringes. They're not making the news. And Richard Nixon tapped into that well, and he got elected. Actually, the Electoral College vote, he won in a landslide over Hubert Humphrey. The popular vote, which was much lower. There was a third-party candidate. Some people thought I might have upset it, but I think he pulled more votes from Richard Nixon than he pulled from Hubert Humphrey, and that was George Wallace, the segregationist. He won 5 southern states. He was just running on a platform of you got to keep whites and blacks separate. That's the bottom line. And of course, we know he gets shot 4 or 5 times and ends up becoming wheelchair-bound for the rest of his life. The happy ending of George Wallace, well, somebody will say, well, he died. That's a happy ending. Was actually, though, his coming about before his death, while he was still in the public arena, to acknowledge how wrong he was with racial identity and racial politics. But in the time, it was very popular. And I have a lot of Wallace buttons, and I certainly don't collect them because he was a racist. I collect them because he played an important part in history. One of the biggest third-party candidate inclusions, if you will. I forgot what I do have it right here in front of me. Yeah, Nixon gets 43% of the vote. Humphrey, in terms of popular vote, very close, 42%. But look at the Deep South. Wallace gets 13.5%. That's very, very significant amount of the popular vote, running as purely a segregationist candidate. Really, really shocking. And Nixon, when he enters office, it's still a very splintered country. In some respects, I see history repeat itself. He's a Republican president, and both the Senate and the House remain Democratic. And so he's got a tough road to hoe trying to get things done that's on his agenda without working with the other party. That's why he was a moderate. A lot of people think he was very conservative. What makes him vilified isn't about his political views. It's about the fact that he tried to cover up an event that he may or may not have direct involvement with. I'll get to in a second. And so he goes to foreign policy right away when he's a president. We know he's the first president to go to communist China. We had other presidents go to China, but not communist China, and to start a process of détente. He also goes to the Soviet Union, which was thought of unheard of, first post-war president to do that. And a lot of peace treaties over nuclear armament and ballistic missiles and things like that were actually signed during the Nixon administration, and it created a period of détente, which I believe stands for French of peace and calm, something to that effect. I'm terrible with language, and I should know what that word means, but détente really put a warming effect on the Cold War, and things actually probably stabilized somewhat, and there was a new recognition that we weren't going to be able to succeed in fighting communism through going into battle with armament and military incursions. What it was more about making peace with the other communist nations to basically create a stability and almost a contractual compact of fiduciary obligations not to make the world explode. And then it goes in here. I love this part because this I do remember OPEC during 1973. OPEC is basically the oil petroleum exporting countries. They decide to do an embargo against the United States, not give us fuel. Most of our gas came from there at that time. I can remember gas, and this is going to show my age. I remember gas at 49 cents a gallon. Of course, my father told me he remembered it when it was 3 or 4 cents a gallon. Well, my father's dead now. That goes to show you. But I remember 1973, not only it didn't matter what the price of gas was, although I do remember going up over $1 fairly quickly. And my father remembers saying, don't forget this price. It's never going to be like this again. Gas was unavailable in 1973, and it was so difficult to get gas because OPEC basically shut off the valve over the Middle East crisis and the feeling that the United States was interfering in Middle Eastern affairs. Part of it was also to drive up the value of gasoline. I can remember being with my father, and he would go out in the morning at like 4:30 in the morning to try to get one of these gas stations that opened up early and get in line because some people would stay from the night before to get gas. That's how bad it was. Of course, we all had gas guzzlers back then. I remember my dad had a van. He was a plumber, and he had a big van, big V8 that probably got like 10 miles to the gallon. But I distinctly remember coming home with my father from a small town called Wales, Massachusetts. We used to have a little shack in the woods, a little camp. And we lived in Springfield, Mass. And I remember coming home and my father saying, I think we're running out of gas. That was back in the day where it was okay to drink a six-pack while you drive down the road. So my father was finishing his last beer, and we're getting to Springfield, Mass. And he says, we're not going to make it. And we pushed the van. We're probably about a mile away from home, but I remember going by this gas station. It used to be called Merritt, corner of Carew and St. James Avenue, I believe. And we were going to get in line. There was this huge line. It was probably 6 o'clock at night. And my father said, we got to keep pushing and waiting. And I always remember some nice, I don't know if they knew my dad or whatever, but they had, when they filled up the car, they filled up a couple of cans of gas, I guess, because that was the nature of the shortage. It was unbelievable. And they gave my dad like 2.5 gallons just to put it in the van and get us home. And I never forgot that, but I never forgot that era of having to wait for gas. And not too long after that, there was another shortage. My brother was in the United States Coast Guard, and I remember being down in Squamish. We were staying for a couple of days at some really tacky hotel with my parents. And my brother was in the Coast Guard, but down how Connecticut worked it to kind of create equity in how gas was distributed. It would be odd plate day, even plate day. So my brother had to get back to I don't know, he was in New London, Connecticut station at the time. He goes to get gas, and he had a big giant Camaro thing. I don't know, he wanted to be cool, he was a young guy. And he goes to get gas. He goes, well, you have an even plate. You can't get gas today. So my brother goes back to the hotel, and there's my mother and father, and he goes, what's going on, Joe? He goes, I couldn't get gas. I have an even plate number. It's an odd day. And I always remember my mother saying, well, brother's name Joe. Goes, Joe, you should have thought of that yesterday. And I remember my brother getting outraged. He goes, that's exactly what I'll do, Mom. Thanks for the solution. And he left, and we didn't hear from him for like 3 weeks. Then, when the anger cooled off and he approached my mom and came home during leave again, he told my mother when he showed the military ID and stuff, the guy let him cut in line to get gas. But this is a really weird phenomenon that we haven't had in a long time. But I remember living through it distinctly, living through a bit of this history. I already went over the Pentagon Papers that came out in 1971. And we know as a result of that, the war really has to come to an end. People are just not going to tolerate anymore. And there's violence on campuses. People die over protesting the Vietnam War. More and more people are refusing to actually go and become drafted during this period of time. And then 1973, the Congress passed the Wars Powers Act, which dramatically reduced the president's ability to wage war without congressional consent. They started holding back money. It had to end. And we know ultimately they do sign a peace accord. That doesn't last very long in the North Vietnamese. After the peace accord, we have no more. There's military there, but we're not going and we're not fighting any battles, but then the North Vietnamese come pouring over and there's nothing we can do. And then there's that big exodus, and there's some great PBS documentaries and others about the fleeing of Saigon, and not only taking American citizens out of there that were working in military staff, but also taking as many people that we could that were loyal to the U.S. government for fear that they would be persecuted, which they were, or injured because they were supportive of the American involvement in Vietnam. So then we know the big one, Watergate. Why is Watergate important? A lot of people think Richard Nixon had direct involvement. I don't think there's any direct proof in it, although there's a couple statements where he says, we got to get in there, we got to get things, blah, 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 blah. That's not the important point of Watergate. The important point of Watergate is these 5 people from the re-election committee of Richard Nixon break into the Democratic stronghold to get evidence, bug the offices, try to find out their strategies. Why is beyond me. Nixon was going to win in a landslide in 72, and he did. He only one state voted for George McGovern, Massachusetts, or the only state that voted for George McGovern in 1972. Nixon won the biggest election, maybe in history. I don't know if it's the biggest, but it's pretty darn close to the biggest re-election. Didn't have to do those things. But what happened after that was Nixon kept denying any knowledge of it, and he did put pressure on the CIA and the FBI to cover it up. There's no question about that. And as a result of that, congressional investigations started taking place over what happened at Watergate. The reason why it's called Watergate, that's where the Democratic National Convention was. Watergate's a big office building, down there. And as a result of the investigation, it became very clear that either Richard Nixon directly or certainly through his subordinates tried to cover up the events of Watergate. And because of that, the House started an impeachment process. Richard Nixon, being no dummy, didn't wait to fight it or anything. He basically did a polling that if the House indicted, would the Senate likely convict the president of high crimes and misdemeanors, removing him from office? And the writing was on the wall, and that's when Richard Nixon gave it. And then the Supreme Court of the United States said he had to reveal all of the tapes that he had in his office because some of the people that broke into the Watergate event said that there was information that would be exculpating, meaning prove their innocence on those tapes. They needed him for trial. Richard Nixon essentially said, no, I have executive privilege. I don't have to turn over my private tapes. The Supreme Court said you do because there's a more important right contained in the Sixth Amendment to have witnesses and evidence brought to your behalf on a criminal trial. So as a result of the tapes coming forward and the contents of those tapes being very embarrassing to Richard Nixon and suggesting that he was well aware of the cover-up efforts and being promoting of it, he ends up withdrawing from office. The only president in history that ever resigned. Others have died. Others have gotten reelected, but none have ever resigned while in office except for Richard Nixon. A lot of people say, oh, there's, go through the presidents that have been impeached. They named Trump as the most recent. Clinton was impeached. Trump was impeached. No, they weren't. Impeached only means charged. None of them were convicted. We've never had a president convicted of an impeachment in the history of the United States. So Trump was impeached. Clinton was impeached. Andrew Johnson was impeached, but Richard Nixon was not impeached because he withdrew before it could occur. We know about Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were the 2 reporters from I believe it's the Washington Post. They're the ones that kept getting information from Deep Throat, the secret informant, either from the FBI or the CIA, that revealed that this cover-up was taking place. And that's pretty much it for Nixon. Gerald Ford, the vice president, becomes president. What does he do within a month in office? And this is one I can actually argue either way on. He pardons Richard Nixon for any crimes he may have potentially done. And the reason why is Ford truly believed it just needed to quiet the nation. We just don't need any more controversy and any more news over the illegality and the lying and the cover-up and the taint of the Nixon administration anymore. And it just needs to end. And that was his argument behind it. But it certainly ruined Gerald Ford's future presidential election. And so on the next election, we know it's going to be between Ford and Carter, and I'll get to that in a second. And so we know the deindustrialization and the rise of the Sun Belt, the North, especially New England, the Northeast, even the Northern Midwest, they, like Detroit, big cities like that, they become less and less industrialized. Jobs move, industry moves, and it moves to what we call the Sun Belt because it's lower taxes. They are not favorable to unions, and the industry is more affordable to run there. And so we have these inner cities that have abandoned factories and blight like no other before. In its heydays of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, early 60s, Detroit was a booming, beautiful community. And I joke with my son today that every so often we're going to go and find a summer place in Detroit. And Detroit's a horror show. It's come back somewhat, but boy, not since its heyday when full jobs and the communities were thriving and all these abandoned buildings weren't there. Yeah, it says between 1947 and 77, the number of manufacturing firms in the city dropped from 3,000 to fewer than 2,000, and the labor force was basically gutted in these areas. Manufacturing firms sought to reduce labor costs by automating, downsizing, and relocating to areas with business-friendly policies like low tax rates, anti-union right-to-work laws, and low wages. Over time, Detroit devolved into a massive unemployment, crime, and crippled municipal resources. I think there's an argument it's still that way today. If you watch, and I'm not necessarily a fan of him necessarily because he taints things a little bit by his view, but he's an interesting guy, and I find him very entertaining. I believe his name is, I want to keep saying Roger Moore, but it might be Michael Moore. He's a documentarian, still alive today. He's a very liberal, progressive individual, but he does a movie which made him famous called Roger and Me. It was about the chairman, Roger Smith, I believe his name was, the chairman of, I think it was Chrysler or GM, I'm not sure which, how they were moving some of their factories to Mexico. And he tried to reveal how Detroit, where I believe was his hometown, really was falling apart. This was long after the 1970s and 80s when it really occurred, but it was still going on when Michael Moore made that film, Roger and Me, depicting how his community really fell apart in a really, really sad area. So conservative politicians, meanwhile, seize on the suspicions of big labor, stepping up their criticisms of union leadership and positioning themselves as the workers' true allies. And I got to admit, my father was a huge union guy, but even he became more conservative in his viewpoint about the role of unions and how the unions may have gotten misguided over time. So as the country entered recessions, wages decreased and the pay gap between workers and managements expanded, reversing 3 post-war decades of contraction. Things were going well for the employees, the workers of the world up until that era, and things have started really changing. And unions represented a third of the workforce in 1950. But only 1 in 10 workers belonged to a union in 2015. Unionism is really tiny relative to what it once was. And now we get the rise, and I might as well talk about it really quick before I end this long diatribe about the 1970s and late 60s. Was the politics of, I do want to talk about this before I get to Jimmy Carter, the politics of love, sex, and gender. We know it changes dramatically during this period. And what do I mean by about love? Well, obviously there's more liberalism in terms of who can love whom and should government have any say in it. We know there were laws right up until fairly recently, actually, that banned certain sexual activity between consenting adults. Those died over time, but the beginning of the erosion of them happened in the 1970s. And one of the big things that led to that was the recognition that people couldn't get divorced in this country, almost anywhere in the country, until the early 1970s, unless you could find fault. And those of you who take family law with me, we still go over the fault grounds because they're still used, because sometimes it can be an advantage for child custody or the division of the marital assets. But in the 1970s, there was a recognition that people should be able to end a marriage that was simply unhappy, or what we call irreconcilable differences, or no fault. And because of that, divorces skyrocketed because many people weren't willing to lie. Many people were willing to lie. I mean, that was the problem. You were forcing people to perjure themselves by ending a sad marriage by saying, yeah, I've been cruel and abusive, or I've been cheating, even though I hadn't been, because I wanted to end an otherwise, difficult marriage. But the floodgates really opened. And some people say this is part of the decay of the American culture because it started then, and it still remains to this day, that nearly 50% of married couples will become divorced. But the no-fault system opened up this concept of being able to freely associate with whom you want. And both parties don't have to agree. One party can say, hey, I'm happier than heck. As long as one party wants a divorce, they get it in every state in the country. And we know Roe v. Wade came in. This is recognition of a woman's right to privacy in certainly the first trimester of her pregnancy. We know that's been changed somewhat, and no longer do we go through the semester analysis. It's more about whether or not the child is viable. If the child's not viable, meaning that far along in the gestation period, a woman pretty much has an unfettered right to get an abortion. After that, once the child's viable, it can be restricted by government. But still, it was a recognition of significant women advances in the rights. We know the ERA never got passed, and it's been brought up recently in society to this day, although the House and the Senate passed it by two-thirds margin, which is required for a constitutional amendment. Only 34 or 35 states passed it. You need 38 states to pass a constitutional amendment. And the reason why is women aren't a monolithic group. Some women are very conservative and don't believe that the ERA Amendment 1 is necessary, but believe it'll actually erode certain protections that sometimes women get in law that wouldn't otherwise be available if there was pure equality in terms of all applications of law in all circumstances. Yeah, by the end of the 1970s, almost every state had adopted no-fault divorce. And then we know the gay and lesbian movement really got, it was moving forever. It was always going on, but it was very difficult because, even the medical community, the psychiatric community labeled homosexuality as a mental disorder or deviant behavior in the criminal codes right up into this era. But we know there was a huge event at the Stonewall in New York City in 1969. Basically, cops would go in and raid gay and homosexual nightclubs and things like that and arrest them for being gay. It was a crime. And people were shocked by that. But this time they fought back, and there was riots over the Stonewall Inn that lasted, I believe, a couple of days, and it was really quite wild. But there was a recognition that these people were being treated arbitrarily unfair simply because of their sexual identity. And that's where it opened up. In fact, there's a restaurant right here in my next town over, the town I lived in for many years, Sturbridge, Mass. And a friend of mine met there recently for lunch. He goes, "Hey, they changed the name recently to Stonewall." He goes, "Yeah, well, that's in recognition of the owners." He goes, "Oh, I thought it was because there's a stone wall that it's made out of fieldstone, part of it." And I said, "No." I said, "You know the owners?" He goes, "Yeah. They're a couple, two guys." And I said, "Yeah, it's in recognition of the Stonewall Inn." He goes, "What's that?" And I said, the bar in New York that arguably started, at least made a benchmark, a watershed moment, if you will, in terms of gay activism, in terms of seeking rights. And my friend goes, "I never even heard of that. I didn't know." And I was surprised that a lot of people don't know history. That's why we study it sometimes, because that's really the sort of I guess today we call it the woke moment of the gay and lesbian movement in terms of overt activism in a big event. Not that there wasn't earlier events trying to advocate for equity and fairness prior to that, but that was a real watershed moment. There's no question about it. Yeah, even 1973, right at basically almost the same time as this event. 69 was a Stonewall, but 4 years later, finally the American Psychiatric Association stopped classifying homosexuality as a mental illness. And I think most of us think that is appropriate. But we know there was some conservative backlash to that. And then the misery index, which I always thought was funny. The misery index was used often by Jimmy Carter when he ran. He was a nuclear physicist. A lot of people don't know. He was a really smart guy. There's no question about that. But he was a conservative or a moderate Democrat, and he was a governor only for one term out in Georgia, peanut farmer as well. Very wholesome, probably very honest, very moral. And I think the nation were calling for that, and they wanted a repudiation of the Nixon administration. So Jimmy Carter really ran a hell of a campaign, too. A lot of people don't realize the networking he did that was novel for that era. And he wins. And Jimmy Carter wins a very narrow election against Ford. And guess what happens? Nothing good after that. Carter probably wasn't the best politician, and he didn't work well with Congress, and he couldn't get much legislation passed. And there were foreign treaties that were designed after the Marshall Plan of World War II that allowed them, West Germany, some countries in South America, other countries that we were trying to build up, had favorable trade compacts. So our goods couldn't sell there too well, but their goods could sell great in the United States. So their economies flourished. Ours developed something that it was a term actually developed during the Nixon or during Carter's administration called stagnation. The unusual event of not only high inflation, prices going up, but also a stalled economy, wages going down, unemployment high. And he actually made a term, or it was somebody in his administration made a term called a malaise. The country was really hurting. And I remember this distinctly because I remember my father losing his employment, being laid off. Like many people, unemployment was very, very high during this era. And I remember my father being devastated and probably a little bit scared about, getting a home and a mortgage and He's got kids and things like that, and I still retain that fear that my father had during this era. And then we had a national crisis over in Iran. Iran gets overthrown. There was a very strong, brutal dictator, the Shah of Iran. We're very loyal to him. We supported him financially, militarily, in every way. But when the religious theologians, I can't even say it, basically the religious Muslim group that basically caused the revolution in that period of time took 53 American hostages. And I remember it very well. Every night you come home. Back then it was like one time there was news. It was 6 to 6:30. The local news was 5:30 to 6. They watch it with my dad. Every night they said, tonight is the 17th night of the American hostage situation in Iran. and Carter's getting beat up because he's not seemingly able to resolve this issue. The economy's hurting, and things just don't seem to be going well. And there's this whole urban sprawl and decay. It was a very, very tough time in American history. And the malaise is, I think, a pretty good term for it. And so the simultaneous onset of inflation and economic stagnation gave the term stagnation. His constant decency in foreign affairs didn't do him any good because of this 52 American hostages lasted during this period of time. And Ronald Reagan comes up, and it's time to make America strong again. And we know that literally the day he was inaugurated, Ronald Reagan, or elected, I'm not sure if it was inauguration or elected, the American hostages were released because they hated Jimmy Carter so much in the Middle East. At least the Iranian government did. He was going to lose in a landslide, and Ronald Reagan certainly did beat Jimmy Carter in a landslide. And it's not any mark on Jimmy Carter. He's still alive today. At least it's this video. If you probably watch it next year, he might be dead. He's no spring chicken. He's gone through a lot of health issues, and he's not young by any means. There's no question, I think history will show him as a very good man, very moral, very honest man. But it's like saying my chef is very good and honest and works hard, but if he serves a meal that's not palatable, the restaurant's probably not going to do well. And that's a very rough and tumble summation of the Jimmy Carter era. I have a friend of mine that loves Jimmy Carter. We need another Jimmy Carter, he says. It was an ineffective president. Nothing could get done. He was in stalemate with the House and the Congress. And it's not because he was stupid. It was not because he was ignorant. It's just the leadership just didn't work under his realm. And we know Ronald Reagan was very, very popular. And I think history judges him as successful, at least in terms of getting his legislation through, whether it was good, bad, or otherwise. But hey, I rambled on a long time, but part of it is because I lived during this era and I remember it. Some of it's good, some of it's good. All in the Family is mentioned in the book quite a bit. My father looked identical to Carol O'Connor. I think there's a picture of Carol O'Connor in the chapter. And people in the neighborhood would often call my father Archie because he looked just like Carol O'Connor. And it was designed to actually be a mockery or a sort of making fun of a bigoted, ignorant, biased, racist individual to show how wrong-headed it was. He actually became extremely popular during that era. Here's a picture of All in the Family right there, and the guy up in the here, Carol Connor. My father looked just like him. But anyways, that was ironic because that Norman Lear film, and later he made a show called Good Times, very, very popular reflection of sometimes American thought that wasn't always so good. But anyways, I talk too much. I hope you guys enjoy whatever time you have and don't waste too much time just listening to me.